The attorney looked at my daughter across the conference table and asked her one simple question. Mrs. Hartley, can you explain to the court why you transferred $340,000 from your father's savings account into a joint LLC without his written consent? My daughter looked at her husband. Her husband looked at their lawyer. Their lawyer looked at the ceiling. That moment right there, that 3-second silence, was worth every painful month that came before it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how we got to that conference table, because the beginning matters. The beginning always matters. My name is Walter Greer. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years building a commercial landscaping company in Tucson, Arizona, from a single truck and a set of secondhand equipment into a business that employed 42 people and held contracts with some of the largest commercial properties in the state. I built that company with my hands, my back, and more early mornings than I can count. My wife Patricia helped me run the books for the first 15 years before she passed from ovarian cancer in 2014. After she was gone, the company became the thing I poured myself into. Not because I was running from grief, but because she had believed in it as much as I had, and keeping it going felt like keeping a piece of her alive. My daughter Renata was 37 when all of this started. She and her husband Derek had been married for 9 years. They lived in a 4-bedroom house in Scottsdale that I had helped them purchase. I want to be clear about that part, because it matters for everything that comes after. I didn't give them that house. I co-signed their mortgage when Derek's credit score made the bank nervous, and I contributed $80,000 toward the down payment as what I called a family investment, not a gift. Not a loan with paperwork, just a father helping his daughter get started. Renata was working as a marketing director at the time. Derek was in commercial real estate. They weren't struggling. I wasn't rescuing them. I was doing what Patricia and I had always planned to do when our children were ready, help them get a foothold. The trouble started 18 months before the conference table. I had a stroke. It was a mild one, as strokes go. I was in my office on a Tuesday afternoon reviewing a bid when the right side of my face went numb and my hand stopped cooperating. My office manager, Carol, drove me to the hospital. I was there for 4 days. The neurologist called it a transient ischemic attack with minor lasting effects. My right hand had some weakness that physical therapy mostly corrected. My speech was briefly affected but recovered almost completely within 6 weeks. I was, by any honest medical measure, going to be fine. Renata arrived at the hospital the morning after I was admitted. Derek came 2 days later on a Thursday, which I noticed but said nothing about. They both seemed concerned in the way people seem concerned when they want to appear concerned. The right expressions, the right questions asked in front of the nurses. But when the doctors left the room, the conversation shifted quickly. "Dad, we need to talk about the company," Renata said on her second visit, before I had even been discharged. I told her there was nothing to talk about. My operations manager, Frank, had everything under control. I had a plan in place precisely for situations like this, a contingency structure I'd spent 2 years putting together with my business attorney. Renata looked at Derek. Derek nodded in a way that I filed away quietly in the back of my mind. I went home. I did my physical therapy. I went back to work 6 weeks later on a reduced schedule, which the doctor approved and I voluntarily chose. I was not impaired. I was not confused. I was a 63-year-old man who had experienced a health scare and was being appropriately careful. What I didn't know at the time was what was happening outside my line of sight. Derek had begun talking to 2 of my minority shareholders, men I had brought into the company 12 years earlier as silent investors. He had been calling them, having lunches with them, positioning himself as a concerned son-in-law who was worried that Walter was no longer capable of leading the business. He told them I had experienced memory problems that the doctors weren't disclosing publicly. He told them my hand tremors were worse than reported. None of this was true. All of it was designed to make them nervous enough to consider selling their shares. I found out about it the way you find out about most things you weren't supposed to know. A coincidence. I ran into one of those investors, a man named Phil Garrett, at a hardware store in November. We shook hands, we made small talk, and before we parted he said, "Walter, I'm glad to see you looking so well. Derek made it sound like you were in rough shape." I drove home very slowly that afternoon. Over the next 3 weeks I made some quiet inquiries. My business attorney, a sharp woman named Sandra Okafor, who had handled my affairs for 11 years, started pulling threads. What she found took my breath away. In the 8 weeks since my stroke, Derek had formed an LLC called Greer Holdings Partners, using my name without my knowledge, and had persuaded Renata to sign documents as my authorized representative based on a healthcare proxy that only applied to medical decisions during incapacitation. He had used that document, creatively and fraudulently, to open a joint business account and transfer $340,000 from a savings account tied to the company into that LLC. The account was in both their names, not mine. When Sandra laid the documents on my kitchen table, I sat there for a long time without speaking. My daughter had signed those papers. Not because Derek had forged her signature, she had signed them herself. I called Renata that evening. I kept my voice level. I asked her to explain the LLC. There was a pause that lasted just a beat too long, and then she said it was for tax purposes, that Derek had explained it to her, that it was perfectly legal, and that she'd been meaning to tell me about it. When? I said. Another pause. Soon, she said. We were going to sit down with you soon. I said goodnight and hung up. Sandra filed an emergency injunction the next morning to freeze the LLC account. Then we began building the case. What followed was 6 weeks of the most disorienting experience of my life. Not the legal work that was straightforward, with Sandra handling it cleanly and efficiently. What was disorienting was my daughter's response to being caught. Rather than come to me, explain herself, or apologize, Renata and Derek went on offense. Derek called my doctor's office and requested my medical records under the pretense that he was evaluating long-term care options. My doctor's office, thankfully, flagged it and called me. Renata began calling my employees, including Frank, who had worked for me for 16 years, asking questions about my behavior at the office, whether I seemed confused, whether I'd made any unusual decisions recently. Frank called me immediately and told me word for word what she had asked. Then came the letter. Sandra received a letter from Derek and Renata's attorney stating that my family had serious concerns about my cognitive health following my stroke and were formally requesting that I submit to an independent neuropsychological evaluation as a condition of continuing to manage company assets. The letter cited a physician's statement signed by a doctor I had never met, never seen, never spoken to, declaring that based on reported symptoms, I may be experiencing diminished executive function. A doctor I had never met. Sandra read the letter to me over the phone. When she finished, she waited. Sandra, I said, what would it cost to make this very, very uncomfortable for them? She said she had some ideas. The mediation was scheduled for a Thursday morning in January, at the offices of a retired judge named Howard Cummings who handled civil disputes. Both parties, both sets of attorneys, one conference table. Sandra had spent the previous week quietly obtaining the bank transfer records, the LLC formation documents, the forged healthcare proxy application, and 3 signed affidavits from employees who had received calls from Renata. She had also, at my request, obtained a full neuropsychological evaluation from the most credentialed cognitive neurologist in Arizona, scheduled 2 weeks before the mediation. My score on every assessment was in the top quartile for men my age. The evaluating doctor wrote, in the summary section of her report, that there was no clinical evidence of executive dysfunction, memory impairment, or diminished capacity of any kind. I had that report printed and bound. Sandra brought 12 copies. When Renata and Derek walked into that conference room and saw me sitting there without a cane, without a caregiver, in a suit I had worn to close the biggest contract of my career, I watched something shift in Derek's face. Not quite fear, more like recalculation. Renata wouldn't look at me directly. Judge Cummings opened the session, reviewed both parties' positions, and then did the thing I had been waiting for. He looked at Derek and Renata's attorney and asked, in the flat, patient tone of a man who had heard every kind of story, whether the family intended to maintain their claim that I lacked cognitive capacity. Their attorney said the family had concerns and believed a formal evaluation was warranted. Sandra slid the bound reports across the table before the attorney finished his sentence. Mr. Greer underwent a complete neuropsychological evaluation 14 days ago, she said, administered by Dr. Caroline Voss at the University of Arizona Medical Center. He scored in the 91st percentile for processing speed, the 88th percentile for executive function, and the 94th percentile for verbal memory. Dr. Voss's clinical conclusion is included on page 12. Judge Cummings turned to page 12. He read it. He set the report down. Then he picked up the LLC formation documents. Mrs. Hartley, he said, using Renata's married name with a quietness that made the room feel smaller. Can you explain to the court why you transferred $340,000 from your father's savings account into a joint LLC without his written consent? My daughter looked at her husband looked at their lawyer looked at the ceiling. That silence. I had waited for it, I had earned it. By the time the mediation concluded, Derek and Renata had agreed to a full dissolution of Greer Holdings Partners, the return of all transferred funds plus interest, and a payment of $28,000 in legal costs. They signed a document acknowledging that the healthcare proxy had been used outside its authorized scope. Their attorney looked like a man who had driven his car into a lake and was now swimming to shore. In the parking lot, Sandra shook my hand and said, "You handled that very well." I had a good attorney, I told her. My phone buzzed before I reached my car. Renata. I declined it. It buzzed again. Derek this time. Declined. By the time I got home, I had 19 missed calls between the two of them. I made coffee, sat at my kitchen table, and listened to the voicemails in order. Renata's first message was controlled, almost rehearsed. "Dad, we need to talk about this. Please call me back. This doesn't have to go any further." The second was less controlled. "Dad, you're being unreasonable. We were trying to protect you. Why won't you understand that?" The third was Derek. "Walter, man to man, this is getting out of hand. Let's have dinner. Let's talk like adults. This is fixable." The seventh message was Renata again, and the rehearsed quality was completely gone. Her voice was tight and climbing. "You want to destroy this family over money? After everything I've done for you? After I sat in that hospital for 3 days while you were hooked up to machines? This is how you treat me? This is really what you think of me?" I deleted them all and saved copies to a cloud folder Sandra had set up for exactly that purpose. I had a granddaughter. Her name was Sophie, and she was 9 years old. She was the best part of my week, every week, for as long as I could remember. We had standing Saturday lunches, just the two of us, a diner on Oracle Road, grilled cheese for her, and a club sandwich for me, and then an hour at the small botanical garden nearby, where she cataloged every cactus species by the placard names. She kept a notebook. She had been doing it since she was 6. 2 Saturdays after the mediation, Sophie didn't come. Renata texted me that afternoon. "Sophie has other plans today." I sat in the diner parking lot for a few minutes, then drove home. The following Saturday, same message. "Sophie isn't available." I called my granddaughter's cell phone. I had given her one for her birthday. A decision that was now the only unambiguous good outcome of my relationship with her parents. Sophie answered on the second ring. "Grandpa." Her voice was small and careful in a way that 9-year-old voices should never be. "Hi, sweetheart. I missed you this weekend." A pause. "I know. Mom said we had things. Are you okay?" Another pause. Longer. "Mom and Dad are fighting a lot, like really loud sometimes. And Mom cried yesterday, which she never does, and it scared me." I kept my voice steady. "I'm sorry to hear that, Sophie. That's hard to be around." "Grandpa, is it true you're trying to take away our house?" There it was. I chose every word carefully. "No, sweetheart. No one is losing their house. Your parents and I are working through some grown-up money things. It's complicated and confusing, but you don't need to worry about it." But Mom said, "Whatever your mom told you, I need you to know one thing. None of this is about you. You are safe, you are loved, and I will always be at that diner on Saturday if you want to meet me. Okay?" "Okay, Grandpa. How's the cactus notebook?" She laughed a little, just briefly. "I found a new one. A totem pole cactus. It's really tall. Save me a page." The next few weeks were quiet in the way that a low-pressure system is quiet before the weather changes. Sandra kept me updated on the fund transfer timeline. Derek and Renata had 30 days to complete it, and the clock was running. Through a contact in commercial real estate, Sandra had quietly learned that their finances were in worse shape than I had realized. They had taken out a substantial home equity line of credit in the previous year, apparently to fund Derek's new investment ventures, and they were carrying $47,000 in high-interest debt across 4 accounts. They could not easily return $340,000. They were going to have to sell something. Derek called me on a Wednesday evening in late February. I almost didn't answer. Something made me pick up. Walter. His voice was different. The easy confidence that had always lived in it was gone. What was left sounded like a man who had been awake for several nights in a row. I need to ask you something. I waited. Would you consider a payment arrangement? For the funds. 12 months instead of 30 days. My attorney handles those conversations, I said. I know. I wanted to ask you directly. He paused. Look, I know I messed up. I know how it looks. I was trying to. He stopped. Started again. The truth is, after your stroke, I genuinely thought we needed to secure things. I told myself it was protecting the family, but I know it was wrong. I listened. Renata doesn't know I'm calling, he added. She thinks I'm at the office. What do you want me to say, Derek? A long silence. I don't know. I think I just needed to tell you it wasn't as simple as it looked. I've made some bad decisions. Financially, and I think I scared myself and then I made it worse. You used my name to open an account without my consent, I said. You called my investors and told them I was mentally deteriorating. You had a doctor sign a statement about a patient he had never examined. That's not a bad decision, Derek. That's a series of choices. No response. Tell Sandra you want a payment arrangement, I said. She'll review it. I hung up. I sat in my living room afterward with the lights low and thought about the version of Derek I had known 9 years ago at his and Renata's engagement party in my backyard. He had been charming and a little nervous, and had asked me genuine questions about the business. I had liked him then. I had been glad Renata had found someone with energy and ambition. I wondered when the ambition had detached from the honesty. April brought the Scottsdale housing market, which had not been kind to people who needed to sell quickly. Derek and Renata listed their house at $715,000 and received no offers for 3 weeks. They dropped it to $690,000. An offer came in at $668,000. They accepted, after paying off their equity line and settling their debts and satisfying Sandra's repayment arrangement. They cleared approximately $190,000. They moved into a rental apartment in Mesa, significantly smaller and significantly farther from the neighborhoods Derek had always referenced casually in conversations as if proximity to them was a personality trait. I heard about most of this from Sophie. She had started coming to our Saturday lunches again 2 months after the mediation, without explanation or announcement. One Saturday she simply appeared at the diner at noon, climbed into the booth across from me, and told me she had found a new cactus species. I didn't ask about her parents. She didn't explain the absence. We ate our sandwiches and walked through the botanical garden, and she showed me 3 pages of new entries in her notebook, and it was the best afternoon I'd had in months. Over the following weeks, in the natural way that children narrate their lives when they trust you, she told me things. Her dad had gotten a new job, a smaller company. Less money, but he seems less stressed. Her mom was working from home now, freelance marketing, and had painted the apartment kitchen yellow because she said it made her feel better. They ate dinner together most nights, which Sophie said they hadn't done in a long time. Her parents still argued sometimes, but it was quieter. Normal, Sophie said, using the word with the confident authority of a child who had recalibrated her baseline. I did not hear from Renata directly for 4 months after the mediation. When she finally called, it was a Sunday morning in May. I was in the back room I used as an office, reviewing quarterly numbers. The phone rang, and her name appeared, and I looked at it for a moment, then answered. Hi, Dad. Her voice was different from every version I had heard in the past year. Not the performed concern from the hospital, not the controlled anger from the voicemails, not the tight climbing pitch of the later messages. It was quieter than all of those. Tired in a real way, not a strategic way. Renata, I don't expect you to want to talk, she said. I needed to call. I've been trying to figure out what to say for a long time, and I don't think there's a right version. So I'm just going to say the true one. I waited. I knew what Derek was doing wasn't right. Not all of it, not at first, but partway through I knew. And I told myself it was for the family, for security, because you'd been sick and we were scared. But that's not the real reason. The real reason is that I've been afraid for years that the company would outlast me, that you'd pour everything into it and there'd be nothing left, and Derek found that fear and handed me a story that fit it. And I let him. I signed things I should never have signed. The room was very quiet. I'm not asking you to forgive me, she continued. I know what I did. I know how it looked, because it looked exactly like what it was. I just needed you to know that I understand that now, and that I'm sorry. Not as a legal strategy, just as your daughter. I had thought about this conversation many times in the preceding months. I had imagined different versions of it, what I would say, how cold I would be, how carefully I would guard against being manipulated a second time. But sitting there on a Sunday morning in May, listening to my daughter's voice sound like itself for the first time in over a year, I found that the speech I had prepared didn't fit the moment. "Why didn't you just talk to me?" I asked. "When I came home from the hospital, when you were scared. Why didn't you just call me and say that?" A long silence. Then, quietly, "Because I didn't think you'd hear me. You and the company, Dad. You and the company are the same thing. I didn't think I could compete with it." I thought about Patricia. I thought about the years after she died when the company had become the container for everything I didn't know how to feel. I thought about how Renata had watched that happen from a daughter's distance. "I'm going to need time," I said. "A lot of it. And I need you to understand that I'm not changing the will and I'm not making any financial decisions based on this conversation. If we're going to rebuild something, it starts from zero." "I know. But Sophie shouldn't be in the middle of this. She doesn't deserve that." "I know that too." A pause. "She talks about you constantly, you know. Every Saturday she comes home and tells me everything you two did. The cactus notebook, the club sandwich. She says you let her explain every single species to you, even when you already know what they are." "I don't actually know most of them," I said. "She's teaching me." Renata made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Not quite, but close." I told her I had to get back to work. She said she understood. We hung up without making plans, without setting a timeline, without any promises that either of us might not be able to keep. That was enough for one Sunday morning. The company's second quarter numbers that year were the best we had posted in 4 years. Frank had handled the months of reduced oversight with the competence of a man who had been ready for the opportunity. I gave him a significant raise and a revised title and a stake in the profit-sharing structure. He looked at the paperwork for a long moment and then said, "You didn't have to do this." "You earned it," I said. "I just didn't get around to making it official." Sandra called me in June to let me know the final transfer had cleared, and the LLC dissolution was complete. Every document was filed, every account closed, every loose thread tied off. She said, in the measured tone of someone who doesn't give compliments lightly, that she'd had harder cases and dumber clients, and that I had been neither. "What do I do now?" I asked her, half joking. "Run your company," she said. "Take your granddaughter to lunch. Try not to give anyone power of attorney unless you absolutely have to." That Saturday, Sophie and I were at our usual booth when she looked up from her grilled cheese and said, "Without prelude, Grandpa, do you think people can change?" I considered the question the way she deserved. I think some people can. I think it's one of the harder things to do, and most people don't do it all the way. But I've seen it happen. "Do you think my dad changed?" I looked at my granddaughter, 9 years old, keeping a cactus notebook and asking the kinds of questions that took most adults decades to get around to. "I think your dad is trying," I said, "and trying, honestly, is more than a lot of people manage." She nodded, satisfied with that, and returned to her lunch. After we finished and walked through the garden, and she added a new entry to her notebook, a saguaro variant she had spotted near the east wall that she was certain was a subspecies of something, she held my hand on the walk back to the car. She was almost too old for that, and we both knew it, and neither of us mentioned it. On the drive home, I thought about what the past year and a half had cost. The legal fees, which were substantial, the months of fractured sleep, the particular kind of loneliness that comes from being betrayed by someone you helped raise, the image of my daughter signing documents she knew were wrong, in a conference room somewhere, while I was doing physical therapy and trying to rebuild the strength in my right hand. But I also thought about what the year had clarified. I knew now, with the precision that only real tests can provide, who was in my corner. Carol, who had driven me to the hospital. Frank, who had called me immediately when Renata questioned him. Sandra, who had been a step ahead at every turn. And Sophie, who showed up at a diner booth one Saturday without explaining where she had been because she already understood, at 9 years old, that sometimes you just have to show up. I pulled into my driveway and sat for a moment before going inside. The front yard had a row of mature Palo Verde trees that I had planted 17 years earlier when Patricia and I first bought the house. She had picked the species specifically, had read about them, had loved the way the green bark made the light look in late afternoon. They were tall now, significantly taller than we had expected, casting shade over the entire front of the house. I had a landscaping company. I knew better than almost anyone how long trees take to become what they are meant to be. And I knew that you cannot rush it. You can only plant the right thing in the right soil and give it what it needs and wait. Renata had sent a text that morning, short and without expectation. Just, "Happy Saturday, Dad. Hope it's a good one." I had not responded yet. I would. Not today, maybe. But soon. Some things need more time. Some things need to earn it. What I knew for certain, sitting in that car with the afternoon light moving through the Palo Verde branches, was that I was done being afraid of my own generosity, done equating money with love, done mistaking silence for peace. If Renata and I were going to find our way back to something real, it would be built on honesty and demonstrated action, not on my discomfort with conflict and her childhood fear of coming in second to a company. The difference between who I was before that stroke and who I was now was simply this. I had stopped confusing kindness with the absence of a spine. I got out of the car. I went inside. I made coffee and sat at Patricia's kitchen table, the one I had never replaced because it still felt like hers, and I wrote down 3 things I wanted the next chapter to look like. Nothing dramatic, nothing that required anyone else to cooperate. Just 3 things I could control. The company, Sophie's education fund, set up directly and cleanly, bypassing every intermediary, and the Palo Verde trees in the front yard, which needed trimming on the south side before summer. Small things, real things, mine. That was enough to start with. If this story meant something to you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you know. And if you've lived through something like this, or you're in the middle of it right now, leave a comment below. You are not alone, and sometimes just knowing that makes the next step a little easier. Click the video on your left for the next story.